The forest was alive with violence when I found them. Two massive shapes locked in combat, their otherworldly roars echoing through the ancient pines. My trembling hands could barely hold the camera steady as I watched a Bigfoot and a DOGMAN tear into each other with primal fury. What happened when I accidentally stumbled into the most documented cryptid territorial dispute in North American history changed everything I thought I knew about the hidden world that exists parallel to our own. My name is Jake Thompson, and I'm a forestry technician for the Pacific Northwest Regional Authority. I've spent 12 years mapping remote wilderness areas, cataloging tree diseases, and monitoring wildlife populations. In all that time, I'd heard the stories. Every forestry worker has. Tales whispered around base campfires about sounds that don't belong, tracks that shouldn't exist, and areas where even the most experienced woodsmen refuse to venture alone. I dismissed them all as folklore until that October morning when my routine survey mission became a descent into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. It started 3 weeks earlier with an assignment that seemed perfectly ordinary. The department needed updated data from Grid Section 779, a remote patch of old-growth forest about 40 miles northeast of Mount Baker. The area hadn't been surveyed in 5 years due to budget constraints and its challenging terrain. Steep ravines, dense undergrowth, and unpredictable weather patterns made it one of our least accessible monitoring zones. I'd drawn the short straw for the solo assignment, but I didn't mind. After a messy divorce and too many nights staring at apartment walls, 3 days alone in the wilderness sounded like exactly what I needed. The morning I set out, October 15th, the weather was perfect. Clear skies, temperature hovering around 55 degrees with that crisp autumn air that makes you grateful to be alive. I loaded my pickup with standard field equipment, including my surveying tools, camping gear, emergency supplies, and the new high-resolution trail cameras the department had finally approved for wildlife documentation. Those cameras would end up capturing something far beyond what any government wildlife survey had ever intended to document. The drive to the trailhead took 4 hours, the last 90 minutes on logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance since the timber companies pulled out in the 90s. My truck bounced and scraped over washouts and fallen branches, the forest pressing closer with each mile. By the time I reached the coordinates where I'd begin my hike into the survey area, the morning sun had given way to the filtered green light of the deep forest canopy. I shouldered my pack, double-checked my GPS unit, and started the 8-mile trek to my designated camping spot. The trail, if you could call it that, was more of a game path worn by decades of deer and elk migration. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop to mark trees with biodegradable survey tape, creating a breadcrumb trail for my return journey. It's a habit that saved more than one forestry worker from spending an unplanned night in the woods. The first unusual sign appeared about 3 miles in. I was crossing a small creek when I noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest at rest, but an oppressive absence of sound that made my skin crawl. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small mammals in the undergrowth. Any wildlife biologist will tell you that when a forest goes completely silent, it means one thing. A predator is present, a big one. I stood perfectly still, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my belt. Black bears were common in this area, and though October meant most were focused on pre-hibernation feeding rather than confrontation, you could never be too careful. I waited, breathing slowly, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. After 5 minutes of nothing, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and continued on. The next 2 miles passed without incident, though that unnatural quiet persisted. I tried to focus on my work, stopping periodically to photograph notable trees, collect soil samples, and record GPS coordinates for interesting features. But my mind kept returning to that silence, to the feeling of being watched that crawled up my spine like cold fingers. I reached my planned camping spot just before 4 in the afternoon. It was a small clearing beside a creek, sheltered by massive Douglas firs that had probably been standing since before Europeans ever set foot in these mountains. I went through my routine of setting up camp with practiced efficiency. Tent positioned on level ground with good drainage, food supplies hung from a bare cable between 2 trees, water filter assembled at the creek's edge. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, I started preparing dinner on my portable stove. That's when I found the first print. I was gathering water from the creek when I saw it, pressed deep into the soft mud of the bank. At first, my brain tried to rationalize what I was seeing. It had to be a bear track, distorted by water erosion or overlapping prints. But as I knelt beside it, my breath caught in my throat. The print was enormous, easily 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. But it wasn't the size that made my hands shake as I placed my own boot beside it for comparison. It was the shape. 5 distinct toes, an arch, a heel. It looked almost human, except no human had ever walked this earth with feet that size. I took photos from every angle, my scientific training overriding my growing unease. I measured the print with my field ruler, noted the depth of impression, the spacing of the toes, the apparent direction of travel. There were more prints leading upstream, each one as clear and impossible as the first. Whatever had made them had passed through recently. Probably within the last 24 hours, based on the sharp edges that hadn't yet been softened by moisture. I followed the tracks for about 50 yards before they disappeared into a section of rocky ground. By then, the sun was setting, painting the forest in shades of orange and shadow. Every instinct told me to pack up and leave, to hike back to my truck in the dark if necessary. But I couldn't. Not just because abandoning a survey would mean explaining why to my supervisors, but because the scientist in me needed to know what had made those tracks. I returned to camp and set up my trail cameras around the perimeter, programming them for motion activation with infrared night vision. If whatever had made those prints came back, I'd have proof. Real, undeniable evidence of something that mainstream science insisted didn't exist. I tried to eat dinner, but the freeze-dried pasta tasted like cardboard in my dry mouth. As darkness fell, I retreated to my tent, though sleep felt like an impossibility. The first sound came just after midnight, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any bear vocalization I'd ever heard, and I'd heard plenty. This was deeper, more resonant, with an almost musical quality that made it even more unsettling. I lay in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, as the sound circled my camp. Whatever was making it was big, and it was investigating. I heard footsteps then, heavy and deliberate, not the shuffling gait of a bear or the light steps of a deer. These were bipedal footsteps, each one making the ground vibrate slightly. They stopped near my tent, and I could hear breathing. Deep, rhythmic breathing from a chest cavity that had to be massive. My hand found the bear spray, though I knew it would be useless against something of that size. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then suddenly a new sound split the night. A howl, but not like any wolf or coyote. This started low and rose to a pitch that made my teeth ache, holding notes that no animal throat should be able to produce. It was answered immediately by another howl from the opposite direction. This one different, more aggressive, with a quality that sounded almost like barking mixed with a human scream. The footsteps near my tent moved away quickly, crashing through the underbrush with no attempt at stealth. I heard the two sources of the howls converging somewhere beyond my camp, their vocalizations becoming more frequent and agitated. Then came sounds of combat, snarls, roars, the crack of breaking wood, impacts that shook the ground. Whatever was happening out there, it was violent and it was big. I couldn't help myself. I had to see. Moving as quietly as possible, I unzipped my tent and peered out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, providing just enough light to see shapes and shadows. What I saw defied every natural law I'd studied in my years of forestry and wildlife management training. Two figures, each at least 8 feet tall, were engaged in brutal combat about 30 yards from my camp. One was covered in dark fur, moving with an ape-like gait but standing fully upright when it struck. The other was leaner, more wolf-like in its features, but also bipedal, with elongated arms that ended in what looked like clawed hands. They circled each other with an intelligence that went beyond animal instinct, feinting, dodging, looking for openings. The Bigfoot, because what else could I call the larger, more ape-like creature, grabbed a fallen log that must have weighed 200 pounds and swung it like a club. The DOGMAN, the wolf-like biped, ducked under the swing and raked its claws across the Bigfoot's ribs, drawing a roar of pain and anger. They crashed together again, grappling, each trying to gain advantage over the other. I fumbled for my phone, managing to start recording video despite my shaking hands. The screen showed mostly darkness with occasional glimpses of movement when the fighters passed through moonlit patches. But the audio was clear. The sounds of their battle were unlike anything in nature, a mixture of primal fury and calculated violence. The fight continued for several more minutes before something changed. Both creatures suddenly stopped, their heads turning in the same direction toward the north. They remained frozen for a moment. Then the DOGMAN let out a series of short barks and disappeared into the forest with impossible speed. The Bigfoot watched it go, then turned its massive head toward my camp. Even in the darkness, I could see its eyes reflecting the moonlight like silver dollars. We stared at each other across that short distance, predator and prey, though I wasn't sure which was which anymore. The Bigfoot took one step toward me, then another. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. It was close enough now that I could smell it, a mixture of wet dog, earth, and something musky and wild. It reached out one massive hand, fingers spread, and I thought my life was over. But it simply pointed. One long finger directed toward the north, the same direction both creatures had looked before the DOGMAN fled. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in a series of grunts and whistles that somehow conveyed meaning. Danger. Leave. Now. The Bigfoot turned and melted into the forest, moving with a silence that something that large shouldn't possess. I remained frozen for another moment, then survival instinct kicked in. I threw everything into my pack without regard for organization, collapsed my tent with shaking hands, and started hiking back toward my truck in the darkness. Whatever had scared off 2 apex predators in the middle of a territorial dispute, I didn't want to meet it. The journey back to the trailhead was a nightmare of stumbling through darkness, guided only by my GPS and the survey tape I'd tied earlier. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow could have been something following me. But nothing attacked. Nothing pursued. I reached my truck just as the eastern sky began to lighten with pre-dawn glow. I drove straight back to the ranger station, not stopping until I was surrounded by the familiar sights of civilization. But when I tried to show my supervisor the video I'd recorded, my phone was dead. Not just out of battery, but completely fried, as if it had been hit by an electromagnetic pulse. The trail cameras I'd set up were the same when I retrieved them a week later with a full team for backup. Electronic components melted, memory cards blank. All I had were my photographs of the footprints and my testimony, neither of which was enough to convince anyone of what I'd witnessed. The official report cited equipment malfunction due to unusual atmospheric conditions. My request to investigate further was denied. The area was subsequently marked as hazardous due to unstable terrain and closed to all personnel. But I know what I saw that night. 2 creatures that shouldn't exist, locked in a battle that suggested a complex ecosystem of cryptids living parallel to our known world. And something else. Something that even they feared lurking in those ancient forests. I've never gone back to grid section 779, but I've also never stopped wondering what else is out there, hidden in the places where humans rarely venture. The nightmares started a few days after I returned. Always the same. I'm back in that tent listening to the breathing outside. But in the dreams, I look out and see not two creatures, but dozens. Bigfoot and DOGMAN, yes, but other things too. Things with too many eyes. Things that move in ways that hurt to watch. Things that whisper my name in voices that sound like wind through dead leaves. And always, always that pointing finger directing me north, towards something worse than all of them combined. I tried to return to normal life, to focus on my work and forget what I'd seen. But how do you forget something that fundamentally changes your understanding of the world? Every forest I entered felt different now, charged with hidden possibility and lurking danger. I found myself jumping at shadows, analyzing every unusual sound, searching for tracks that didn't belong. 3 months after the encounter, I received a package at my apartment. No return address, no postmark, just my name written in block letters. Inside was a flash drive containing dozens of files, videos, photographs, audio recordings, all documenting encounters similar to mine. Bigfoot, DOGMAN, and other things I didn't have names for. The metadata showed they came from all over North America, spanning decades. The most recent file was a text document containing only GPS coordinates and a date. The coordinates led to a location about 200 miles south of my encounter site. The date was 1 week in the future. Against every shred of common sense I possessed, I decided to go. I took personal leave from work, packed camping equipment and cameras with multiple backup batteries, and drove to the coordinates. They led to an abandoned logging camp deep in the Cascade Mountains, a collection of rotting buildings that hadn't seen human occupation in years. I arrived just before sunset on the specified date and set up my equipment, not sure what I was waiting for or who had sent the package. As darkness fell, they began to arrive. Not creatures, but people. Men and women of various ages, all with the same haunted look in their eyes that I saw in my mirror every morning. We didn't exchange names, didn't share personal details. We didn't need to. We all knew why we were there. We had all seen things that couldn't be explained, couldn't be forgotten, couldn't be shared with anyone who hadn't experienced it themselves. An older man, probably in his 70s, seemed to be the unofficial leader of the group. He'd been documenting encounters for 50 years, he said, ever since his own experience as a young forest ranger. He explained that we were part of an informal network of witnesses, people who had encountered cryptids and lived to tell about it. The package I'd received was their way of reaching out, of letting me know I wasn't alone and wasn't crazy. They shared their stories that night, each one more incredible than the last. A truck driver who'd hit something on a remote highway that left fur and blood but no body, despite the impact that should have killed any normal animal. A hiker who'd been stalked for 3 days by something that walked upright but left claw marks 15 feet up on tree trunks. A family whose camping trip ended when something massive shook their RV in the middle of the night, leaving handprints that spanned the entire width of the vehicle's side panel. But the most disturbing stories were about the other thing, the presence that both creatures in my encounter had fled from. They called it the Ancient, though that was more description than name. It had been reported throughout the Pacific Northwest for generations, always as something felt rather than seen. Indigenous legends spoke of it as a guardian or god of the deep forest, something that predated even their oldest stories. Modern encounters described an overwhelming sense of dread, electronic failures, and cryptids fleeing in terror. The old man believed the ancient was the apex of the hidden ecosystem, the thing that kept the cryptid populations in check and prevented them from expanding into human territories. The territorial fight I'd witnessed was probably a dispute over boundaries, with both creatures venturing too close to the ancient's domain. My presence had been incidental, a human accidentally caught in the middle of a conflict between forces we barely understood. As dawn approached, the gathering dispersed. We exchanged contact information, agreed to share any new encounters or evidence, and went our separate ways. But before I left, the old man pulled me aside. He handed me a leather journal, worn and water-stained, filled with hand-drawn maps and notes in various hands. "This is 40 years of tracking and documentation," he said. "Patterns, territories, seasonal movements. If you're going to keep working in the forest, you need to know where not to go." I studied that journal obsessively over the following weeks. The maps showed clear patterns. Certain areas had consistent cryptid activity, others were always avoided. The avoided areas formed a rough circle in the deep wilderness, hundreds of square miles that even the cryptids wouldn't enter. At the center of that circle was grid section 779, where I'd had my encounter. The journal also contained protocols for safe passage through cryptid territories. Never camp near water sources at night. Avoid areas with unusual silence. If you hear wood knocking, knock back 3 times to indicate you're just passing through. If you smell wet dog mixed with sulfur, leave immediately. Never ever investigate crying or calling sounds that seem to come from injured humans. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to my forestry work, but with a completely different perspective. I learned to read the forest in new ways, to recognize signs that my training had never covered. Twisted branches at specific heights, scratch marks in patterns that weren't random, areas where the undergrowth grew differently because something large regularly passed through. 6 months after my initial encounter, I had my second major experience. I was conducting a routine disease assessment in a stand of Douglas firs when I noticed the trees were marked, not with disease but with symbols carved into the bark. They were old, probably decades, but maintained, recently traced over to keep them visible. The symbols matched ones I'd seen in the journal, markers that meant neutral ground in what the network had pieced together as a cryptid communication system. I was photographing the symbols when I heard footsteps. Heavy, bipedal, approaching from the east. I didn't run. The journal had taught me that running triggered predator instincts. Instead, I sat down, made myself small and non-threatening, and waited. The Bigfoot that emerged from the tree line was smaller than the one I'd seen fighting, probably a juvenile, though still at least 7 feet tall. It watched me for a long moment, then moved to one of the marked trees and added a new symbol with its fingernail, the keratin hard enough to gouge the bark. We existed in the same space for perhaps 5 minutes, each aware of the other, but neither making aggressive moves. Then it left, disappearing into the forest with that unsettling silence. I waited another 10 minutes before examining the new symbol. It was different from the others, simpler, almost like an arrow pointing north. A warning? A message? I photographed it and left the area without completing my survey. That evening, I received a text from an unknown number. Just coordinates and a time, another gathering. This time, the meeting was urgent. 3 members of the network had disappeared in the last month, all in areas previously considered safe. Their last communications mentioned unusual cryptid behavior, creatures acting agitated, aggressive, moving into territories they'd historically avoided. The old man who led the network had a theory. Something was pushing them out of their traditional ranges. The ancient was expanding its territory. Or perhaps something else, something new, was moving into the ecosystem. Either way, the careful balance that had kept humans and cryptids mostly separate for generations was breaking down. We needed more information, but official channels were useless. Government agencies denied the existence of cryptids, universities dismissed evidence as hoaxes or misidentifications, and mainstream media treated encounters as entertainment rather than investigation. We were on our own, a handful of witnesses trying to understand and document a hidden world that most people couldn't imagine existed. I volunteered to help with the investigation. My job gave me legitimate access to remote forest areas, and I'd learned enough from my encounters and the journal to navigate cryptid territories with reasonable safety. Over the next year, I conducted informal surveys alongside my official duties, mapping encounter sites, documenting tracks and signs, recording vocalizations when possible. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Cryptid sightings were increasing dramatically, but not in their traditional territories. They were being pushed into edge zones, areas where human and cryptid worlds overlapped. Hikers were reporting strange sounds and glimpses of impossible creatures. Hunters were finding kills that had been scavenged by something that left the wrong kind of teeth marks. Rural communities were dealing with livestock disappearances that couldn't be explained by known predators. Then came the video that changed everything. A member of our network, a wildlife photographer named Amy Chen, managed to capture clear footage of not just one cryptid, but a group of them. The video showed at least 4 Bigfoot and 2 DOGMAN moving together through a mountain pass, not fighting, but apparently cooperating. They were carrying young, fleeing something off camera that had them constantly looking back in fear. The implications were staggering. If different cryptid species were working together, it meant the threat they were fleeing from was worse than their territorial instincts. The ancient, or whatever was driving this migration, represented a danger that transcended species boundaries. I decided to go back to grid section 779, not to the exact site of my encounter, but to the periphery, to set up long-term monitoring equipment and try to understand what was happening in that avoided central zone. I told my supervisors I was taking extended leave for personal reasons, packed supplies for a month in the field, and drove back to the place where everything had started. The forest felt different immediately. It wasn't just the silence, though that was oppressive as always. It was a feeling of wrongness, like the air itself was hostile to human presence. I set up a base camp 5 miles from the central zone, in an area the journal marked as a buffer territory. Close enough to monitor, far enough to possibly survive if things went wrong. For the first week, nothing happened. My equipment recorded normal forest sounds and activity during the day, dead silence at night. No cryptid signs, no unusual phenomena. I began to wonder if I'd wasted my time and resources. Then on the 8th night, everything changed. It started with the equipment failures. All my cameras died simultaneously at exactly 2:43 a.m. Not just powered down, but destroyed. Their electronic components fused and melted. My GPS unit, phone, even my digital watch, all dead in the same instant. Only my analog compass and mechanical equipment survived. Then came the sound. Not a vocalization, but a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. It rose and fell in a pattern that felt deliberate, almost like communication. The trees around my camp swayed without wind, their branches creating shadows that moved in impossible ways. And then I saw it, or rather I saw the absence of it. A section of forest about 100 yards from my camp simply wasn't there anymore. Not destroyed or cleared, but absent, as if reality itself had been edited. In that void, something moved. I couldn't look at it directly. My eyes wouldn't focus, my brain wouldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive and microscopic, singular and infinite, present and absent all at once. The ancient, if that's what it was, existed in a way that human perception couldn't fully grasp. But I understood one thing with perfect clarity. We were insects to it, barely worth noticing. The cryptids weren't fleeing from malevolence, but from indifference, from something so far beyond our understanding that our presence or absence meant nothing to it. The void collapsed, reality snapping back into place with an almost audible sensation. The forest returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after witnessing something like that. I packed up what remained of my equipment and left immediately, driving through the night and not stopping until I'd put 300 miles between me and that place. When I tried to describe what I'd seen to the network, I found I couldn't. Not because they wouldn't believe me, but because language itself was insufficient. How do you describe something that exists outside normal space-time? How do you explain an entity that makes 8-foot-tall cryptids flee in terror but doesn't seem to notice or care about humans at all? The old man listened to my stumbling attempts at explanation and nodded slowly. He'd heard similar accounts before from indigenous elders, from researchers who'd gone too deep into the wilderness and come back changed. The ancient wasn't just a cryptid, wasn't just another species sharing our world. It was something else entirely, possibly something that had been here long before any life we understood, something that existed in dimensions we couldn't perceive. That was 2 years ago. Since then, the situation has continued to deteriorate. Cryptid encounters have become almost commonplace in certain areas. The network has grown from a dozen witnesses to hundreds, then thousands. Social media is flooded with blurry photos and videos, most fake, but enough real ones that the authorities can't completely suppress the truth anymore. Official explanations range from mass hysteria to elaborate hoaxes to misidentified known animals. But those of us who've seen them, who've looked into the eyes of a Bigfoot or heard the howl of a DOGMAN, we know better. We know there's a hidden world existing parallel to our own, and that world is in crisis. The territorial boundaries that kept humans and cryptids mostly separate for millennia are breaking down. Whether it's due to human encroachment, climate change, or the expanding influence of entities like the ancient, the result is the same. Two worlds that evolved separately are being forced together, and neither side is prepared for the consequences. I still work as a forestry technician, though I've transferred to areas with lower cryptid activity. I still contribute to the network, sharing information and helping new witnesses process their experiences. But mostly I try to understand what I witnessed that night when the Bigfoot and DOGMAN fought in front of my tent. Were they fighting over territory, over resources, over something we don't understand? Was their conflict part of a larger pattern of cryptid behavior that we're only beginning to glimpse? And what about their reaction to the ancients' presence? The immediate cessation of hostilities, the coordinated flight, suggests a shared knowledge or instinct that transcends species boundaries. I've gone through the footage I managed to capture that night thousands of times. The video from my phone may have been destroyed, but I had a backup camera in my pack that survived, though the footage is dark and grainy. With enhancement, you can make out the shapes of the two creatures, see their movements, hear their vocalizations. It's not enough to convince skeptics, but for those who already believe, it's confirmation of what we've suspected all along. The fighting itself is fascinating from a behavioral perspective. Both creatures displayed intelligence far beyond what we attribute to known animals. They used tools, the Bigfoot wielding that log as a weapon. They employed strategy, feinting, and maneuvering for advantage. They communicated not just through vocalizations, but through body language that suggested complex information exchange. But it's what happened after the fight that haunts me. That moment when both creatures detected the ancients' approach, their immediate cooperation in fleeing, and the Bigfoot's warning to me. It showed not just intelligence, but empathy, a recognition that I, a human, was also in danger and deserved warning. That gesture, that pointed finger directing me to safety, suggests a level of consciousness that forces us to reconsider our place in the natural order. I've thought about going public with everything I know, writing a book or creating a documentary. But who would believe it? And more importantly, what would be the consequences? If the general public suddenly accepted that cryptids were real, that our forests harbored intelligent beings we've been inadvertently destroying through development and resource extraction, what would happen? Would we protect them, create preserves and protocols for coexistence? Or would we hunt them, study them, destroy them in our fear and curiosity? The network debates this constantly. Some believe disclosure is necessary and inevitable. Others think we should protect the cryptids by maintaining their secrecy. I fall somewhere in between, believing that gradual education and preparation is better than sudden revelation or continued denial. The indigenous communities have known all along, of course. Their oral traditions speak of the tall, hairy ones, the wolfwalkers, and the ancient spirits of the forest. They developed protocols for coexistence, rituals for safe passage, offerings for protection. We dismissed their knowledge as superstition, but they were documenting encounters with cryptids centuries before. We admitted they might exist. I've spent time with some of these communities, learning their stories and perspectives. They don't see cryptids as monsters or anomalies, but as elder siblings, beings that share our world and deserve respect. They speak of agreements made generations ago, boundaries established, mutual understandings that allowed both human and cryptid populations to thrive. But those agreements are breaking down. Modern society doesn't recognize ancient boundaries. We build where we want, extract what we need, expand without consideration for what might already be there. And now we're facing the consequences. The cryptids are being forced into our spaces because we've taken theirs. The ancient is stirring because we've disturbed something that should have been left alone. The fight I witnessed was just one small skirmish in a larger conflict we don't fully understand. Cryptid species that have coexisted for millennia are now competing for diminishing resources and territory. The stable ecosystem that kept them hidden is collapsing, and we're going to see more encounters, more conflicts, more evidence that can't be explained away. Just last month, a small town in Oregon was evacuated due to what authorities called a chemical spill. But network members in the area reported something different. Massive tracks around the perimeter of the town, trees stripped of bark at heights no known animal could reach, and vocalizations that caused mass panic among domestic animals. The evacuation lasted 3 days, just long enough for whatever was there to move on. These incidents are increasing in frequency and intensity. The network tracks them, documents them, tries to find patterns and predict where the next encounter might occur. We've developed an alert system warning members when cryptid activity spikes in certain areas. It saved lives, helping people avoid or prepare for encounters that could have been fatal. But we're fighting a losing battle. We're a handful of civilians trying to monitor and understand phenomena that should be the subject of serious scientific study. We need resources, equipment, expertise that we simply don't have. Yet we continue because we've seen what's out there. We know what's coming, and someone needs to document it, even if no one believes us yet. The memory of that night haunts me, but it also drives me. The image of those two impossible creatures locked in combat, their raw power and primal fury, reminds me that we share this world with beings beyond our current understanding. The warning from the Bigfoot, that gesture of cross-species compassion, gives me hope that coexistence might be possible. And the presence of the ancient, that incomprehensible entity that defies our understanding of reality, humbles me with the knowledge of how little we truly know about our world. I think about the future often. What will happen when the evidence becomes undeniable? When clear video footage emerges that can't be debunked? When a cryptid is captured or killed and examined by mainstream scientists, the world will change overnight. Everything we thought we knew about biology, evolution, and our place in the ecosystem will need to be reconsidered. Some in the network believe this revelation is imminent. They point to the increasing number of encounters, the breakdown of territorial boundaries, the migration patterns that are pushing cryptids into populated areas. They say it's only a matter of time before an encounter happens that can't be covered up or explained away. Others think the secret will be maintained indefinitely. They believe that those in power already know about cryptids and have systems in place to suppress evidence and discredit witnesses. They point to the way my equipment was destroyed, the way certain forest areas are suddenly closed to public access, the way witnesses are dismissed as attention seekers or mentally unstable. I don't know which group is right. Maybe both are in their own way. Maybe the truth will emerge gradually through accumulated evidence and testimony that slowly shifts public perception. Or maybe one dramatic incident will tear away the veil and reveal the hidden world in all its terrible wonder. What I do know is that I'll never forget what I saw that night. The sound of their battle, the fury in their movements, the intelligence in their eyes. I'll never forget the moment when they both sensed something worse approaching, their immediate cooperation in the face of a greater threat. And I'll never forget that pointed finger, that warning from a creature that conventional science says doesn't exist, saving my life from something even more impossible. The forest feels different to me now. Every shadow could hide watching eyes. Every unusual sound could be a vocalization from something that shouldn't exist. Every track could be evidence of the parallel world that shares our space. It's terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I've lost my ignorant comfort but gained a deeper understanding of the true complexity of our world. Sometimes late at night I wonder if they remember me. Does that Bigfoot recall the human it warned? Does the DOGMAN think about the witness to its territorial dispute? Or are we so insignificant to them that individual humans blur together just another hazard or curiosity in their hidden world? I've never returned to Grid Section 779 and I never will. Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, some mysteries shouldn't be investigated too closely. The ancient, whatever it is, deserves its solitude. The cryptids deserve their territories. And we humans need to learn that we're not the only intelligence on this planet, not the apex of creation we've believed ourselves to be. But the fight continues. Not the physical battle I witnessed, but the struggle for space, for resources, for survival in a world that's changing faster than any of us can adapt. The cryptids are fighting to maintain their territories. We're fighting to expand ours. And somewhere in between, in those edge zones where our worlds overlap, conflicts like the one I witnessed will become more common. The network continues to grow. Every week brings new members, new witnesses who've seen something that shattered their worldview. We share our stories, our evidence, our theories. We support each other through the disbelief of friends and family, through the nightmares and the paranoia, through the fundamental shift in perspective that comes from knowing what's really out there. Some of us become obsessed, spending every free moment researching, investigating, searching for more evidence. Others try to forget, to return to normal life, to pretend they never saw what they saw. Most of us fall somewhere in between, living with the knowledge but not letting it consume us, continuing our regular lives while keeping one eye on the shadows. I've found a balance that works for me. I continue my forestry work, but I choose my assignments carefully, avoiding known hotspots and territorial boundaries. I contribute to the network, sharing information and helping new witnesses, but I don't actively seek out encounters anymore. I've seen enough to know that some things are better left alone, but the memories remain vivid. The sound of their combat, flesh against flesh, claw against fur. The way they moved, powerful and graceful despite their size. The intelligence in their actions, the strategy in their fighting. And that moment of shared recognition when the Bigfoot looked at me, saw my fear, and chose to warn rather than harm. That's what gives me hope. If a creature that could tear me apart with its bare hands could show that kind of compassion, maybe coexistence is possible. Maybe we can find a way to share this world without destroying each other. Maybe the breakdown of boundaries will lead not to conflict but to understanding. Or maybe I'm naive. Maybe the increasing encounters will lead to fear, violence, and tragedy on both sides. Maybe the revelation of cryptid existence will trigger a panic that destroys both their world and ours. Maybe the ancient will expand its influence until neither human nor cryptid can survive in its presence. I don't have answers, only questions and the memory of an impossible night when I watched two cryptids battle in the moonlight. But that memory, that evidence of a larger, more complex world than we've imagined, has changed everything for me. It's shown me that mystery still exists, that there are still frontiers to explore, still fundamental truths about our world waiting to be discovered. The fight between the Bigfoot and DOGMAN was just one small glimpse into that hidden world, a window that opened briefly, showing me wonders and terrors beyond imagination, then closed again, leaving me forever changed. I don't know if I'll ever see anything like it again. Part of me hopes I won't. But a larger part, the part that drove me to become a forestry technician in the first place, the part that loves the wild places and their secrets, hopes that someday I'll understand what I witnessed. Until then, I continue to document, to share, to prepare for whatever comes next. Because change is coming. The hidden world can't stay hidden forever. The boundaries between human and cryptid territories will continue to erode. And when the truth finally emerges, when the world accepts what some of us have known all along, we'll need voices of reason, people who've seen both the wonder and the danger to help navigate the new reality. I am one of those voices, a witness to the impossible, a documenter of the hidden, a bridge between two worlds that are destined to collide. My name is Jake Thompson, and I saw a Bigfoot and a DOGMAN fight in the deep woods. What I learned that night changed everything I thought I knew about our world. And it's only the beginning. The sun is setting now as I finish writing this account. Outside my window, the forest stretches to the horizon, dark and full of secrets. Somewhere out there, cryptids are moving through territories older than human memory. Somewhere, the ancient stirs in dimensions we can't perceive. And somewhere, two apex predators might be facing off again, their conflict a symptom of larger changes we're only beginning to understand. I used to think I knew the forest. 12 years of education and experience had taught me about ecosystems, wildlife behavior, and forest management. But that night showed me how little I really knew. There's another forest, a shadow forest, existing alongside the one we've mapped and studied. It has its own rules, its own inhabitants, its own complex relationships that we've never acknowledged. That shadow forest is bleeding into our world now. The carefully maintained separation is breaking down, and we're not prepared for what's coming. How could we be? We've spent centuries convincing ourselves that we're alone, that we're the only intelligence, the only apex predator. The truth is so much more complex and terrifying than we've allowed ourselves to believe, but it's also more wonderful. The existence of cryptids means that magic, in a sense, is real. Not supernatural magic, but the magic of discovery, of mystery, of knowing that our world still holds secrets. Every time I remember that night, despite the terror, I feel privileged. I witnessed something few humans have seen and lived to describe. I was given a glimpse behind the veil that separates our comfortable known world from the wild, impossible truth. The other members of the network feel the same way. We've been changed by our encounters, marked by them. We can't go back to ignorance, can't unsee what we've seen. So we move forward, documenting, preparing, waiting for the moment when the rest of the world joins us in acknowledging the truth. That moment is coming sooner than most people think. The signs are everywhere if you know what to look for. The increasing number of unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas. The rising frequency of unusual wildlife behavior reports. The growing number of trail and park closures with vague explanations. The pattern is clear to those of us who've been watching. Something fundamental is shifting in the balance between our world and theirs. Maybe it's climate change altering traditional territories. Maybe it's human expansion pushing too far into sacred spaces. Maybe it's the ancient or something like it, awakening or expanding its influence. Maybe it's all of these factors combining to create a perfect storm of revelation. Whatever the cause, the effect is undeniable. The hidden world is becoming visible. The cryptids are being forced into the open. And humanity is about to face the reality that we're not alone, have never been alone, and must learn to coexist with beings that challenge everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. I think about that Bigfoot often, the one that warned me. Where is it now? Did it survive the territorial changes? Does it remember the small human it saved from something worse? I like to think it does, that somewhere in its intelligence is a memory of our brief encounter. A moment when two vastly different species recognized each other as fellow conscious beings deserving of compassion. That's the future I hope for. One where the revelation of cryptid existence leads not to fear and violence, but to understanding and coexistence. Where we learn from indigenous wisdom about living alongside these beings. Where we adjust our behavior to accommodate their needs as they've been forced to accommodate ours. Where the wonder of discovery outweighs the terror of the unknown. But I'm not naive. I know human nature. I know that fear often wins over wonder, that our first instinct when confronted with the unknown is often to destroy it. The network prepares for this too, developing protocols for protecting both humans and cryptids when the truth emerges. We're creating educational materials, establishing communication channels with authorities, building frameworks for peaceful coexistence. It may not be enough. When the world changes overnight, when people realize that every forest could harbor intelligent beings that dwarf us in size and strength, panic is almost inevitable. But we have to try. Those of us who've seen them, who've witnessed their intelligence and even their compassion, have a responsibility to be voices of reason in the chaos that's coming. The fight I witnessed was brutal, primal, and terrifying. But it was also proof that these beings are more than monsters. They have territories, social structures, conflicts, and resolutions. They're part of a complex ecosystem we don't understand, playing roles we can't fathom, living lives parallel to but separate from our own. As I finish this account, I can hear the forest coming alive with nocturnal sounds. Owls, coyotes, the rustle of small mammals. Normal sounds that I once took for granted but now analyze carefully. Because sometimes mixed in with the familiar are sounds that don't belong. A branch breaking under massive weight. A vocalization that no known animal makes. The silence that falls when something large passes through. The forest knows, it's always known. The trees have witnessed the cryptids for centuries, keeping their secrets in the rings of their growth. The mountains have sheltered them. The rivers have reflected their images, the caves have hidden their young. Nature itself is complicit in maintaining the secret, but that conspiracy of silence is ending. Soon, very soon, the world will know what I know, what the network knows, what indigenous peoples have always known. We are not alone. We share this world with beings that challenge our understanding of biology, intelligence, and our place in the natural order. The fight between the Bigfoot and DOGMAN was just one small revelation of a much larger truth. I close my eyes and I'm back there, in that tent, listening to them circle each other in the darkness. I can smell the wet earth, feel the vibration of their footsteps, hear their otherworldly vocalizations. The terror is still there, will always be there. But so is the wonder, the incredible, overwhelming wonder of witnessing something impossible made real. My name is Jake Thompson. I'm a forestry technician who stumbled into a world hidden in plain sight. I watched two cryptids battle in the moonlight and lived to tell about it. I was warned by a creature that shouldn't exist about a danger I couldn't comprehend. I've seen behind the veil that separates the known from the unknown, and I can never go back. This is my testimony, my contribution to the record that will someday help humanity understand that we've never been alone in these forests, that we've always shared our world with intelligences different from, but perhaps equal to our own, that the monsters in our folklore and nightmares are real, but they're not what we thought they were. They're not demons or supernatural entities. They're biological beings, products of evolution just like us, trying to survive in a world that no longer has room for mysteries. They're refugees from the march of progress, casualties of our expansion, victims of our disbelief. But they're also survivors, adapters, beings of immense power and surprising intelligence. The fight continues, not just between Bigfoot and DOGMAN over territory, but between the old world and the new, between mystery and revelation, between fear and understanding. We stand at the threshold of a new era, one where the impossible becomes possible, where myths become reality, where humanity must expand its definition of what it means to share a planet with other intelligent life. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if we'll find a way to coexist or if the revelation will lead to tragedy for both sides. I don't know if the ancient will remain in its deep places or expand until there's nowhere left to hide. I don't know if I'll ever see them again, those impossible creatures that changed my life with their brief, violent appearance. But I know this: the truth cannot be hidden forever. The evidence is mounting, the encounters increasing, the boundaries dissolving. Someday soon, the world will wake up to the reality that we are not alone, have never been alone, and must find a way forward that acknowledges the rights and needs of all Earth's intelligent inhabitants. Until that day comes, I'll keep watching, keep documenting, keep preparing. Because I've seen what's out there. I've witnessed the clash of titans in the deep woods. I've been warned by impossible creatures about incomprehensible dangers. I've glimpsed the shadow world that exists alongside our own. And I know with absolute certainty that everything is about to change.